Welcome to the London Property Podcast, your trusted guide through the complex and ever-evolving world of London real estate. We help clients manage, protect, and grow their property wealth by connecting them with the right expertise from finance, law, and tax to construction, design, and strategic advice. Through conversations with industry leaders, we bring you clear, practical insight into the trends, challenges, and opportunities shaping the market. Let's dive in.
Welcome to London Property. I'm your host, Farnaz Fazaipour, and today we're doing our market updates for the first quarter of 2026, and we're delighted to welcome to the show Ben Sloane. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So Ben plays a holistic role in the property market, not just as an agent, but also advising international clients and local clients. So I'm going to hand it over to Ben to tell us from his perspective. Ben, what do you think is happening in the prime central London property market?
Quite a lot. I think for anybody watching this, we know there's been a number of changes, some directly to the property market or relating directly to in terms of legislation, some which have affected the property market in terms of tax and legislation changes. I think that's had quite a large effect, to be quite honest. The biggest outcome I've seen from that really is rather than values drop massively, although values have dropped rather astonishingly a lot in some areas, is really a shortfall of transactions.
Yeah.
There's a lot less movement in the market than you would have seen typically at any point, you know, even less so than 2008. It really ground to halt, and I think that was a lot to do with the amount of kite flying the government did pre-budget. And a number of the tax changes that they announced in budget, and people waiting to see how they came out, what effect that would have on the market, which always takes a little bit of time to kind of feed into the market.
So your takeaway is that, again, we're in a wait and see and a hold situation. So the transaction numbers have been what's mostly affected. People are holding out.
I think that when we finally got the budget, it was helpful in the sense that people then had some form of clarity, and they were able to then go, right, well, there's not really much point in me holding out for a year. It's not like prices are going to be X better or the tax regime is going to be X better. If I'm going to sell now. The problem that you've got is who is going to be buying a property at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, with the tax changes we've made and the surcharges on stamp duty, you know, if you're a foreign national and it's an investment property as well, for example, there are other areas, you know, in the world, if it's property, you can deploy your capital with far better returns. And there are other areas of industry, you know, stocks, etc., whatever it is, that give you much better ROI as well. So you've got to look at really you're either selling to end users, which is quite you know, it's a significantly smaller target audience, or you're selling, you know, notably BMV, notably below market value, and somebody knows is getting a good deal, or you've got a unicorn property, which is you buy it now or you're never ever going to be able to get that sort of thing again, and they're absolutely fine, but that's not the general market.
So basically, we're sort of all waiting for the market to settle itself, and it's indicating that we're going towards domestic demand because
I think
so much is being, you know, they've attacked the international buyer, whether they're investors or buying for themselves in so many different ways.
Even domestic buyer investors, to a large extent as well, depending on their ownership structure, they'd purchase a property, and, you know, that they've been seriously hit too. And then you've got legislation such as the Renters' Rights Act and how that's going to affect, you know, people wanting to either get into or remain as a landlord in, you know, of a property that's exposed to the Housing Act. a building we look after, we actually transitioned from being long lets into service departments in order to.
Because there's so
not
many
be
things
exposed.
that you could make mistakes with
Yeah.
when it comes to the paper trail.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
You know, I think there are 174 pieces of legislation in the Renters' Rights Act. It's impossible. I do think there's an opportunity for agents here, which I hope isn't missed. I say this as not being exclusively an agent myself, but if ever a letting agent has been most valuable and most essential to landlords, it's now a good letting agent, and you can really justify your fees if you know what you're doing, because there's so many landmines that an inexperienced or not extremely experienced landlord could possibly wander into. I think it's also going to be, I don't know if it's ever been mentioned before, but I'm quite keen to see what happens in the May London by-elections, because the political uncertainty isn't helping this country, the country's economy either. We've seen what's happened in non-London by-elections, and I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens in London. I think if Labour loses to the level it's lost in other by-elections, it'd be quite disruptive. The final outcome, good or bad, depends on your political opinion, but it'll be quite disruptive because it'll lend more uncertainty, or it'll go absolutely fine, because typically London, Labour does quite well, and we need some form of continuity.
Well, in my world, I have to say that a lot of the non-DOMs were considering waiting out for a change of government and then coming back. But, as you say, certainty is always better for markets than uncertainty. But
well, do you mind if I expand on that point a little bit?
Sure.
So, for what it's worth, I actually agree with you. I don't think Labour. I don't think Labour's economic policies are very good. I think they're quite damaging. I think sometimes they're not aware quite how damaging they are. And we've got the same situation with a number of our ultra net worth clients, and those not even based here, but would consider investing here if there was a change of government. If you consider, look, we've left the EU. We currently don't have the most wonderful relationship between our PM and the American president. We're effectively an isolated little island that, instead of other isolated little islands all around the world who are extremely tax-friendly and entrepreneurially friendly as well, the UK doesn't do any of those things.
Anymore.
Yeah. So I'd like to see either a change of government or a change of policy. I think the latter is unlikely. I think the former is quite likely. It's a matter of when. It just comes down to more market disturbance, so rather than anything else. But I agree with you. I think that there's no way. I personally, I'd be interested to see what your other guests have thought about this. I can very clearly see a situation within 5 to 10 years where the Renters' Rights Act gets superseded by another piece of legislation. I think it will be that disruptive and disastrous
on the rental side.
But the rental side affects the entire property market fully, and the property market affects the entire economy fully. We're really the property market in the UK is the tip of the economy, it's the tip of the arrow of the economy, really. So they need to get that right.
You're listening to the London Property Podcast. We help clients manage, protect, and grow their property wealth. If you find this conversation useful, don't hesitate to get in touch. Now, back to the conversation.
I mean, one thing that we notice, we do news bulletins every week, and obviously what we've seen is everybody's affected by housing. So when it comes to politicians, it's always, they're always targeting housing because that's how they're going to get the most attention. You know, if they change something, I don't know, for pensioners, they're not necessarily going to cover the whole population. Whereas when they target housing, so it becomes this sort of political ping pong. And then we
Yes.
sit here and go, oh, no, not again. Now we have to wait. And the process has to take into consideration what the industry say. I think there needs to be a lot more consultation with the industry in order to get it right. Now, the effect of all of this has been that the market, I mean, reportedly, generally speaking, is probably 15 to 20% down. Do you think there's going to be further correction?
I do, yeah, I do.
And do you think that's across the board, or do you think it's going to be at certain price ranges, in certain areas, in Prime Central we're talking?
Strictly Prime Central. Look, there are always going to be outliers. For example, I could see Marylebone holding up a little bit better than Mayfair, Belgravia, Knightsbridge. So there are always going to be slight outliers, but I do think there's going to be further market correction.
I was going to say Marylebone is quite limited, isn't it, in the residential offering? So there's a demand and supply issue going on there. So that's a good point.
Yeah, and it's still got headroom to grow into. That'll be offset, but it means instead of suffering as much as the others, and prices continue to correct themselves in other areas, it will be less hit, less heavily hit.
And what do you think? How much more is there to come off?
I think rents are quite clearly only going to go up. Reason being the number of landlords exiting or trying to exit the market. People who would have been landlords no longer coming into the market. So there'll be a supply-demand issue, which obviously always affects pricing. On top of that, as you're now no longer able to take over asking price, well, to account for that, you'll increase your asking price. That doesn't always mean you'll do it in a general market, but if everybody's doing it, then it does.
Yeah. You have to aim high in order to not be against the legislation.
Yeah. So, whereas in the past, if somebody, when they asked for an asking price that was on the punchier side, you go, well, that's going to be quite difficult considering in the same building, this property just 6 months ago let for that. This is what I think it's worth. Every landlord and every agent advising the landlord will, I believe, be aiming high to give some headroom for negotiation. So if everybody does it, that's quite different to how it used to be with the odd person asking for a punchy price. And if you tie that into the lack of supply, rents are only going to go up. So that's going to be a real sting for tenants across all levels of society, really, especially when they've dropped they've lowered the stamp duty threshold as well. Interest rates are higher than they've been for a long time. Nothing you and I guess, wouldn't have been used to, but certainly for people who are newer to the industry and newer to buying property, they might not be used to these sorts of rates. They might not have accounted for it. There's a lot of different factors at play.
Yeah. I hope in 12 months' time, we're not having a conversation where we go, so the asking price in rentals is X, but the real value is Y. And then that becomes our standard way of discussing what's going on in the rental market to accommodate for this. Because markets do adapt. And, my initial reaction to the rental reform was, if you're a genuine rental investor, which, as a family, we have been for over 40 years, then why would you care if your tenant stays forever?
Absolutely.
And, why would you care if your tenant paid monthly? And all those kind of things. But I see what you're saying, and it is a fact that people are leaving because of it, and people are reluctant to come in. But
if I can provide some context on that, because
Yeah.
like I've got a portfolio. I've never served notice on a tenant to leave for no reason. I mean, I love continuity of tenancy. I usually don't put our rents up for many years. My key thing is getting the right tenant in, not getting an extra few £100 a month and squeezing them for as much as I can. But you've got to remember, it's not just about not being able to serve Section 21s. You have no certainty of tenure now. Your tenant can move in on day one, serve notice, they're out. You've done an inventory. You've done a professional clean. They've moved out. You've then got to do a new inventory, new professional clean, because you can't charge them costs if it's in the Housing Act. Next tenant comes in. Maybe there's a void period in that too as well, by the way. On the other hand, you, at some point, if you did want to sell, personally, I don't sell my portfolio, but if you did, you have to grant the tenant 12 months tenure, minimum. You have to give 6 months notice to sell. And if you don't sell, you're not allowed to re-rent that property for 1 year after tenant leaves. Well, regardless, you're not allowed to once that tenant leaves, if you're using that ground. If you wanted to move back into property, it's 4 months notice. So there are quite a few things. And you say, do you mind if a tenant pays monthly or not? Well, if they're domestic and they pass their references because they're income earning, then no. Or if they've got a UK-based guarantor, no, you might not. But in PCL, there are a vast amount of Housing Act level properties. They can be right up to the top of the Housing Act in terms of price point, but still within the Housing Act. So there'll be the Renters' Rights Act will affect it. That rely on international students or people being paid internationally, and therefore non-UK based income. And normally it asks them for rent in advance, but you can't now.
Or could you, as a managing agent, and hold it and pay the landlord? I mean, I think the market will find ways around some of these things. But yeah, no, I hear you.
So I've done quite a bit on renters' rights. I would... Can I give a shout out, a recommendation to people? I would suggest people follow David Smith on LinkedIn, for example. He's an absolute expert.
I know him from his original job at Payne-Smith Solicitors. I know who you mean.
Yeah, he's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
From what I understand, you can't induce a tenant to offer to pay rent up front. If a tenant offers it of their own accord, I mean, I'd be cautious, but the wording isn't...
No, I was actually not referring to that. I was referring more to people who can't show any referencing because they've got no history here. And, in a way, you're blocking them out then.
You are, yes, that's my point.
Because you can't reference them, and then you can't get them to give you a guarantee by paying in advance. So there must be a way of having some kind of an escrow service that pays on their behalf. But
you'd wish, right?
Who knows?
You'd have thought.
Right.
You'd have thought. But this is what I mean, where I don't think that the government has truly understood.
Well, no, they never do.
No, but that's a serious issue.
Yeah.
A huge amount of rental properties and PCL smaller units do go to international students, and even the larger units, international families, for example. And if there's no way to reference or then to pass referencing, so you're stuck in this catch-22. I think it'd be interesting to stress test whether it would be possible even for companies, maybe there's an opportunity for companies to be set up where a tenant pays that company a fee and a company rents a property in that company's name with the individual as a permitted occupier, which would take it out of the Housing Act.
Yeah,
And,
I'm a
and then they
firm
can pay
believer
rent up
markets
front.
always do find a way. So
They will,
something will happen.
but it's an interesting example of how government really hasn't fully considered how this affects.
Yeah. Well, including the fact that the tenants are not going to be able to afford the rents because everybody is going to have to charge more. There's less people who are bringing in the supply. So, yeah, I mean, on all sorts of fronts, it hasn't been thought about. Have you noticed, I know that the transaction levels have been lower, but have you noticed that demand from certain countries, certain types of people have been more than others? Is there any trend that you're noticing that is coming out?
A lot of activity on blocks and hotel fronts. A lot of institutional capital deployment, and a lot of individual landlords wanting to exit. I'd say those are the things I'm seeing most commonly at the moment.
Yeah. So on the subject of markets finding ways, if you want to invest in the property market and you still want to make money out of the property market, you need to just change the way that you're doing it.
Exactly. So
and there's money to be made if you do that.
There's money to be made. Look, if you are a landlord and you're non-leveraged, you bought it to be your pension, and you bought it when buy-to-let started really taking off in the early 90s. Well, okay, here we are 35 years later, end of mortgage lifespan. Your mortgage is paid off, you're non-leveraged, and you're in your 60s, 70s, you're probably not going to want to have to get involved in Renters' Rights Act, and be subject to higher tax and high legislation, potential penalties, having to register with an ombudsman, not being able to get your property back to sell it. So you're going to sell. And there comes a point where you go, okay, I know that I'm getting 10 or 20% below what I could, but I bought it for X, so who really cares? And I'm exposed to so much capital gains as well. I just want out.
Yeah.
So you're going to sell
those are the ones
B&B.
who are more ready than others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the problem comes if that's your neighbour. Well, you can't hold out for that price because your neighbour's just sold it that. So I think that will affect the market. When you asked about if it's going to carry on depreciating, I think that is one example of how the market will carry on depreciating.
Depending on what other people do.
Depending a lot.
Which is the reverse of what we had, I don't know, 15 years ago, where it's like, oh, that guy sold it for that much.
Exactly.
I want 10% more.
Exactly.
And it just kept going that way.
Yeah.
Which is why they had to address it, because it became unaffordable for the locals.
100%. So I'll give you an example. A property in a building that we look after the owner's portfolio, actually. He'd love to sell it, and it's worth 2.5 million all day long. But another apartment, basically the same, actually about 200 square foot larger, in the same building, on the floor below, also had a bit of outside space attached to it, little terrace, sold at 2 million. So he's stuck. Not only is he stuck because but some buyers would say, hold on, another one just sold for the amount. But when it comes, if they're getting lending, well, a surveyor's going to find that property, this other property that sold it was a little bit larger and had outside space, and it sold for 500,000 less. So he's never going to be able to achieve 2.5 million. That's a direct working example right there.
Now, before saying thank you and goodbye to you, we have asked some of our colleagues about the London-Dubai kind of investment relationship. And you can either comment on that or tell me what you think is an alternative investment destination that you've seen people go to.
Oh, okay. So we actually run a series called Ahead of the Curve on LinkedIn, specifically about markets that are, I guess, ahead of the curve, that are not really known that much or talked about as much as the loud ones. Look, obviously, Dubai has done wonderful things over the last mean, Dubai now compared to Dubai 10 years ago is just fundamentally different. I think that there are a few places that are really, really interesting. Malta is a really good investment, and both as end user and investor. It's in the EU. It's got a very, very, very good tax regime. It's safe, very limited land. The economy is doing very well and growing. That's a really interesting one. If you wanted the EU alternative to Dubai, I really like Malta, for example. Look, Dubai is Dubai. We know what it is. I think it's oversaturated in terms of multi-unit towers a little bit. Now, whether you think Dubai South will or won't take off is a subjective opinion. There are other Emirate states, RAC, for example, which I see a lot of headroom for uplift in. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the Middle East right now, so a lot will depend on that. I think there will be some effect on Dubai and Dubai pricing as a result of that. I think the veil might have been lifted slightly, and people who went out there to this tropical, utopian oasis have had the veil lifted back slightly of this is actually still the Middle East, and I say that as a Middle Easterner. So that might have some effect, but look, it's still very solid. I think Riyadh as a long shot, for a 2030 vision, that's a really interesting one. If you wanted to get in still relatively early, that would be quite interesting too. Milan is fantastic.
They did definitely grab a lot of our very, very wealthy ex-residents, didn't they?
They definitely did.
In Italy. Well, listen, thank you so much for talking to us. I'm sure we could carry on and on, but we'll save it for another time.
Thanks you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
So if you are looking for advice and you have specific questions, then obviously here at London Property, we connect you to the specialist who can help you. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks for listening to the London Property Podcast. If you'd like guidance on managing, protecting, or growing your property wealth, get in touch. We're here to help. And if this episode proved valuable, share it with someone who takes the market seriously and make sure you're following so you never miss an update.